Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, this is such a good day, yeah. Welcome to Mubyarto Policy Forum 2024. Today's topic is how to build a diverse nation, lessons from Indonesian experience. Yeah. And also I need to mention that this event is hybrid. So let me say hi to the audience in the Zoom. Where is the camera? Maybe that way. Hello, welcome to Mubyarto Policy Forum. And as mentioned by Pak Firman earlier, today we will discuss about the nation building in Indonesia, highlighting the significance of policy in historical context. We will also emphasize the influence of Professor Mubyarto's work, which integrates social justice with development. And of course, for such an interesting topic today, we will have three amazing speakers. So let me invite the speakers to the stage. Please, for Professor Sam, Pak Rian, and also Pak Jahen to take the stage. All right. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen. I will start to introduce Professor Samuel Bazzi. Is it okay if I call you Sam? All right, Sam. So here, Sam got his PhD in economics from University of California, San Diego, and also his BA in Economics and International Relations from University of Southern California. And then his academic position is professor in the School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California, San Diego, and also professor from the Department of Economics, University of California, San Diego. And then he has honor and awards here, Rafael and Marina Pastor Counselors Endowed GPS Faculty Fellowship, and also National Science Foundation Career Award. Please give round of applause to Sam. All right, and then also we have our beloved lecturer here, Bapak Dr. Muhammad Rian Sanjaya. Pak Rian got his PhD in economics from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. And then he also got his master in international and development economics from Australia National University and bachelor in economics from UGM or Universitas Gadjah Mada. Pak Rian is currently assistant professor here in FEB UGM and also the deputy director of the Bachelor of Economics program Universitas Gadjah Mada. And then he also get honor and awards Indonesia Endowment Fund for Education Scholarship or LPDP as we know it. And then Australian Development Scholarship. Please give applause to Pak Rian. Okay, and now we have an honorable guest from Universitas Indonesia. We have Dr. Jahen F. Rezki or Pak Jahen. Pak Jahen get his PhD from University of York, and then MS in Development Economics from University of York, and BA in Economics from University of Indonesia. Pak Jahen is currently assistant professor from Department of Economics Universitas Indonesia, and also vice director of research from Institute for Economics and Social Research, or as we know it, LPEM FEBUI. And also Pak Jahen is invited researcher in JPALC. And then there is honor and awards, JPALC Fund with Asad Islam, Arman Sim, and Giovanni Van Empel, and also Alice Hunter Teaching Scholarship from the University of York. Please give applause for Pak Jahen. Okay, I know that everyone is probably already excited at this point. So without further ado, I will give time for Sam, please.
Hello, hello. Okay. All right. I'm gonna stand. That's okay. Yes, great. Yeah, usually more comfortable that way. Hi, everyone. This is it's really an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in Jogja. Jogja was the first place I landed when I first came to Indonesia in 2005, and have been back many times since. And it's lovely to be here. It's my first time at UGM. And I've had a wonderful visit so far, and I'm looking forward to today and the next few days. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, giving me the honor of being the keynote speaker today. What I'm going to do today is try and give you a sense of the kind of arc of Indonesian nation building, why it matters for development, and try and draw some lessons from Indonesia for the rest of the world. Okay, so to give you a sense of, what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to begin by giving you a sense of what we mean by nation building. Okay, it's important that we are on the same page and have a good understanding of what this term means. I'll give you a sense of what the research and policy landscape looks like in terms of thinking about nation building from both an economics and a political science perspective. I'll spend a few slides giving you a very brief history of Indonesian nation building, and kind of set the stage for what I'm going to spend most of the talk doing, which is giving you some background on my own research on the nation building process and experience in Indonesia. And then what we'll do at the end is close with some thoughts and a sense of what's the future look like, right? How should we think about bridging research and policy and thinking about nation building here in Indonesia and in the world more broadly? Okay, all right. So before I get into kind of defining nation building, what I thought it would be helpful to do is just try and situate Professor Mubyarto's work in what I think is very much kind of a nation building framework, right? I had enjoyed reading some of his papers. I've listed the one here from 1984 in the BIES, Social and Economic Justice. But if you look at the history of Professor Mubyarto's work, in thinking about his work on economy Pancasila, economy kerakyatan, like it's really infused with thinking about how social and cultural issues shape our economic lives, right? And really what he was focused on in for part of his life as a scholar and engaging with policy was how do we bridge the gap between urban and rural Indonesia? How do we mitigate some of the divides between the rich and the poor, right? Which of course is inherently important on its own, but it's also critical to thinking about maintaining socio-political stability, which is itself crucial for economic development and progress. And if you look at the debates, the economy Pancasila debates, there's a kind of a rich history of these in the 1970s and 80s. These were really debates thinking about how should we think about the process of economic development as it interacts with identity, with building cohesive, integrated society in Indonesia, given its amazing diversity. And I just mentioned briefly, his own research really kind of indirectly influenced a lot of my own work. So you'll see some of that work today. But he's also done, of course, a lot of work through PSPK here at UGM on village governance and development, something I'm spending a lot of time working on today with various colleagues. And of course, he's done a lot of really fascinating research on the important role of rice in the rural economy, which has featured prominently in some of my own early research. So taking a big step back, if we just ask, what does the global production of written work on nation building, what does that evolution look like? Here's a graph from Google Ngrams, right? Just kind of counting up the frequency of nation building as a phrase in the corpus of texts that Google has put together. And you can see this kind of steady rise through the late 1900s, all the way into the early 2000s, kind of growing interest in nation building. It's petered out a little bit recently, but that just gives you a sense of kind of the growing corpus of written work on nation building. What I also did was ask ChatGPT, right? We all know ChatGPT. I asked, hey, what are the words that are most associated in your massive corpus of text with nation building? What other words are closely associated with it? And here's a word cloud kind of showing that, right? So you see terms like assimilation, cultural integration, state formation, national identity. These are the kinds of things that are going to come up in the rest of our talk today. Now, from a research perspective, within economics, there's been a resurgence in interest in nation building. Okay, it's of course interesting and important in its own right, thinking about the process of political change and development, but it's also critical to thinking about economic progress and change as well. Okay, and here's a book that came out recently on the left there, summarizing the massive growing body of work on nation building. I just held a conference last April, bringing together some kind of frontier work in this area. Okay, so it's an exciting time to be working as economists on nation building. Now, what is nation building? And how is it different from another term that you might have heard, which is state building? Okay, so here's Napoleon, the famous French leader historically, who wrote that if a child is not educated from infancy, how they should think about themselves in terms of their identity, that the state can never constitute a nation. It's going to rest on these uncertain and shifting foundations, and it's constantly going to be exposed to disorder and change, right? So that's one perspective from a couple hundred years ago. Here is a more concrete set of definitions from Alesina and co-authors, and to give you a sense of what we think of as state building, right? This is really the construction of state institutions, right? The bureaucracy that is necessary to do things like collect revenues, provide public goods, and to fight wars and do the things that we commonly associate with government, right? How is that different from nation building? Well, nation building is really about building a national identity, right? And it's a process. Historically, it was the process that led to the formation of countries, where citizens felt this commonality of interests, right? And they didn't want to separate from each other and form distinct nation states, okay? Now, if you think about nation building historically and today, diversity is going to be really central to that process, okay? And if you look around here in Indonesia, of course, but also look at the European Union project, the United States, all of these political entities have this notion of unity in diversity, right? And in many ways, nation building is really about bringing together diverse groups in the population and creating a cohesive sense of identity around which they can integrate into a nation. Okay, and Benedict Anderson is a famous social scientist who's done lots of work on Indonesia. He talked about imagined communities. How is it that someone in Aceh could feel like they belong to the same nation as someone from Maluku, right? This is the notion in which we need to build an identity that can bring people together, even if they've never actually come into contact with each other. Okay, and so if you look historically, here's a great statement from the founder of modern Italy, right, in Europe. He said, Italy has been made. We've made the state of Italy. Now we need to figure out how to make Italians, how to make Italian people. If you look at Herbert Feith, famous scholar of Indonesian politics, he has this great observation that if you look at kind of the history of nation building in Indonesia, it's really about building a common language, a common outlook, and severing ties to traditions and loyalties that are, in the view of the nation builder, outmoded and should be replaced by a cohesive national identity. And that really the challenge in Indonesia historically was how do we destroy the ethnic barriers and create in society at large, in all of Indonesia, the same sense of cohesive Indonesian identity that one saw in the national independence movement. Okay. Now, some may think this is just a kind of historical project of nation building, but if you look around the world today, rapidly urbanizing countries, bringing people into contact with each other for the first time from different backgrounds. If you look at immigration into many countries around the world, changing the ethnic and religious mix of the population, it's really a kind of big challenge. As countries are diversifying, how do we create this broader sense of we, this identity that is novel and cohesive and integrated? Nation building is, of course, a historical project. It was about building new countries in the aftermath of war, right? It's also a process of decolonization, and you see this in different parts of the world at different points in history. But it's also an unfinished project today, continuing that project of forging identity around a national kind of form. It's also about bridging persistent social and cultural divides in diverse societies and preventing some of the kind of latent intergroup tensions and divisions from blowing up into outright conflict. Okay? Now, where do those divisions come from? They come from lots of places. They come from ethno-linguistic background, from racial background, from religion, from class, which can create divisions in society, and the list goes on. And when we think about measuring diversity, there's kind of three important measures that we're gonna want to think about as we move on in the lecture today. The first is what's called fractionalization. Okay, and this is just the probability that two randomly drawn people within a society are from a different group, okay, whatever that group is. There's also a notion of polarization, right, which is capturing something a little bit different. It's capturing the extent to which groups are alienated from each other and how strong the identity is within the groups, okay? And then finally, there's this notion of segregation. Right? How spatially segregated are the different groups in society for a given level of diversity in the society as a whole? Okay. Now, it's important to remember, we're going to talk about identity, but one thing we're going to be seeing a lot of is that identities can change, right? They're endogenous, right? They're going to respond to political and economic changes in society, and that's going to be important for thinking about the future and how we think about managing diversity. Now, if we look at Indonesia, which of course this audience knows better than any that I typically discuss work on Indonesia with, Indonesia is an incredibly diverse country. If here's one map visualizing some of the broad ethnic groups, but it's also a country that, in general, has pretty high levels of spatial segregation. So if you look at the median village in Indonesia, there's only about a 5% chance that two randomly drawn people in that village are from the same ethnic group, okay? Which is to say that most villages in Indonesia are very homogeneous, okay? That's not true of urban areas, of course, but in the typical village, it's pretty homogeneous. If you look around the world and kind of compare Indonesia, here's a map just showing fractionalization country by country. You can see that Indonesia's it's in the top 25 countries in terms of diversity. It's most similar to Ethiopia and the Philippines in terms of its level of diversity. So it's a very diverse place, not the most diverse in the world, but incredibly diverse. It's about in the middle for polarization. Okay, so not so polarized in terms of the ethnic divisions, which is important at a macro level, as we'll see later on. But it does have reasonably high levels of segregation as well. Okay. Now, when we think about development, Professor Mubyarto is first and foremost a development economist. I was trained as a development economist. When we think about development, nation building is also an important ingredient. Okay, and why is it an important ingredient? Well, what is nation building about? It's about creating social cohesion and inclusion, right? And these are really critical inputs to both the micro foundations of trust in society and the macro foundations of social and political stability, all of which are really essential to providing public goods and creating an environment that is conducive to investment. This way of thinking about nation building and development, it also really is consistent with recent work on effective states, on state capacity, a popular topic in economics right now. And it's consistent with that thinking that nation building as a process can in turn help facilitate state building, help facilitate effective governance in building a strong kind of foundation for development. Okay, why does nation building matter for development? There are lots of reasons. If we look historically, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that lots of strategic choices are made by policymakers at different points of history. And some of these are really, if we look back in hindsight, really critical junctures for development and kind of the trajectory of politics. So just a couple of examples from Indonesia that we'll see featuring later on, directly and indirectly. At the founding of the country, they established Bahasa Indonesia, of course, as the national language. They didn't choose the language of the largest ethnic group, the Javanese. That was a very critical decision, and one that set Indonesia apart from many countries. And there were also important constitutional choices that were made both at independence in terms of the role that Islam would play in the state, the role that Sharia would play in Indonesia, and also in the Reformasi era, right? In democratization and the way in which the government rewrote the constitution and explicitly created kind of barriers to the formation of regional or ethnic parties, which if you look in many diverse countries around the world have been a major source of conflict. Nation building also matters for development because it helps it preserves kind of development successes, right? Conflict destroys economies. Nation building creates the foundations for stability, okay? And if we think about the kind of pathways to successful building, there are many different pathways. The two most prominent ones are to homogenize the population first, and then create representative institutions. Okay, so here in Indonesia, of course, many years ago, they mandated Bahasa Indonesia in the school system. So that was to homogenize the language and really build that kind of core foundation. There was also efforts in the decentralization era to offer representation while allowing for diversity and heterogeneity in local political preferences. One example would be the allowance of Perda Sharia in the era of decentralization. Okay, and countries vary widely in how they implement, which path they choose, and lots of countries, including here in Indonesia, will mix between these two pathways. Okay, so what is nation building in terms of actual policies? I've listed here a bunch of different studies, but I'm not going to talk about them in any detail, but just to mention, except my own later on, but just to mention, nation building as a kind of policy toolkit involves things like schools, it involves language policies, it involves creating opportunities through institutions and organizations for individuals from different backgrounds to mix together and kind of build a collective effort in the pursuit of some goal. There's also a role for persuasion, right? And this can take various forms. Leaders engage in efforts to persuade the population to follow their objectives. Media plays a big role. I think of redistribution as a nation building policy, right? Why? Because you're trying to mitigate class divisions in society and allow people to find common ground and not think of themselves as distinct along class lines. Wars are obviously important in a historical and even modern sense of nation building. And then thinking about political representation, okay? So there's a lot of examples of what we would think of as kind of top-down nation building. Right? Governments imposing policies from the top down. But there's also a process of bottom-up nation building that happens organically in the process of modernization and development when people are moving away from their communities, from their tight-knit kind of kin networks, maybe moving to urban areas, and detaching from their kind of ethnic and linguistic homelands, right? And that can disrupt traditional communal structures. Some people have recently argued that these top-down policies that we just saw on the previous slide, that they're ineffective often against what you can think of as these bottom-up social and economic forces. Okay, and in some ways, if we think about Professor Mubyarto's work, he talked a lot about gotong royong and other kind of cooperative structures in Indonesia that really shaped the way that communities were interacting with the process of development. It's this kind of strong social response to these top-down plans of policymakers. So there's a range of public policies that governments implement, and oftentimes these policies are bundled together, and social groups are really potentially going to push back against those efforts. And if we think about the trajectory of long-run development, it's really, you can think about it as kind of a contest between strong states imposing policies from the top down, and strong societies, strong social groups pushing back and trying to kind of compete with the state objectives. And we'll see that in the work I'm going to describe shortly. Okay, so just very briefly on Indonesian kind of nation building history. One thing I did in preparing for this talk was I went back and read the kind of anti-colonial movement history in Indonesia. And what you see in kind of a lot of the discussions that were being had among the leaders of the independence movement, it's a lot of the same conversations that are being had in the post-independence era and even today, right? It's these competing visions for how to think about Indonesian identity and the state. And so there's really two buckets here, the colonial era and then the post-independence and really post-New Order era, right? I haven't done work on that first bullet, but I'm just going to summarize what I think are some interesting kind of elements of it that set the stage for the work I'm going to spend the rest of the talk today describing. Okay, so if we think about the anti-colonial struggle, right? Where did it come from? Well, first, thinking about where the concept of Indonesia came from, right? The name itself was something that showed up in a British traveler's notes on how to think about the archipelago, right? And this is a term that kind of appealed to the early independence movement, leaders like Muhammad Hatta and others that were studying in the Netherlands and building student movement for independence. And if you look at this history, schools are playing a really critical role, right? What are schools doing? Well, of course, they're educating us, right? But they're also bringing people together from different backgrounds, okay? And so you can see this kind of important role of schools in forging contact between people from very diverse backgrounds. Okay, so the first medical school in Indonesia, of course, this is during the colonial era. Stovia is now a Museum Kebangkitan Nasional in Jakarta. But this was a really important hub of course, these were elite men from young native men from different parts of the country, but they were coming together and kind of learning about their different ethnic and regional backgrounds. And the same thing was happening in the Netherlands, where a lot of Indonesian elites were studying, and they formed student groups. And you can see the evolution of the group names, right? From Indisch Vereniging, I don't speak Dutch, but it went from thinking about as the Indies, right, to Indonesia, to what we know as a very important vehicle in the independence movement, Perhimpunan Indonesia, which there's the flag up there on the upper right. And this was really the cradle of nationalism. And the leaders in this movement thought of themselves and their work as transcending class and also religion and coming together in a kind of cohesive identity. There's also another important institution, another important school, Osvia, which was basically a civil servant training college and was the predecessor to what is now M.Int.Dev.Ec, right? Which even today plays a very important role in bringing together young Indonesians from all over the country to work to learn together and prepare themselves to enter the bureaucracy. Whoops. Okay, not sure. Okay, so that was the anti-colonial period. The post-independence period, which is where most of my own work is concentrated and where we'll spend the rest of today talking about, this is an era where the government of Indonesia is deploying lots and lots of policies, right? In all of those different categories that I listed on the earlier slide. What I'm going to talk about today is really those first five. Right? Some work I've done thinking about schooling, language, mixing and intergroup contact, redistribution, and also political representation. In the future, I think there's lots of exciting things to think about in terms of the role of conflict, external threats, as well as media and propaganda. Okay? Now, what I'm going to tell you about in the next I guess half hour, 40 minutes. I'm going to tell you about 4 studies that I have done with an amazing set of co-authors, several Indonesian co-authors who some of you might know, that have tackled some of these nation building policies, okay? And what we're going to see kind of time and again is strong top-down policy efforts to bring Indonesians together in new ways. And then we're going to see these strong social responses that sometimes complement what the government is trying to do, but sometimes compete and push back against it, okay? And offer kind of a competing vision for policy change. Before I do that, I want to make a shout out to my amazing discussants and their work, which is very much related, not by coincidence, but very much related to our thinking about nation building. So Professor Ediono can't be here, unfortunately, but she's done some amazing work on the role of curriculum and how schools are shaping identity and ideology in Indonesia. Jahen has done some amazing work on technology. What role is technology playing in shaping social development? What role are Islamic parties playing in the diverse Indonesian political landscape? And thinking about how that all interacts with the process of social and economic change. Professor Rian has done very recently some really nice work on diversity, social conflict, and social capital. And we'll see actually some of his findings resonating quite closely with some of what I'm going to show you momentarily. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into a couple of the kind of core empirical studies that I'm gonna describe to you today. So the first one is titled "Unity and Diversity: How Intergroup Contact Can Foster Nation Building." This is a project where we're trying to revisit the very famous policy in Indonesia known as transmigrasi, right? All of you have surely heard of this program, one of the largest population resettlement programs in the entire world in modern history. 2 million migrants during this really concentrated period in the 1980s were moved from Java and Bali into 900 or more newly created villages in the outer islands. This program had a lot of objectives. The one that I'm going to focus on today is the nation building one, right? Where the goal was to mix inner and outer islanders and kind of create these new communities that could be vehicles for integration. And so what I'm going to try and walk us through is how to think about the role of diversity in these communities in shaping nation building. Okay? So here's a remarkable quote from the Minister of Transmigrasi in 1985. He said, "By way of transmigration, we're going to integrate all of the ethnic groups into one nation, the Indonesian nation. And the different groups in the long run are going to disappear because everyone's going to be integrated and there's only going to be one identity, and that's going to be Indonesian." That's a very strong statement, right? But this was one vision of the leaders of this program. Of course, there was a lot of skepticism about that. Some people called the program Javenisasi and not transmigrasi. Okay, and so there is this kind of tension that was, at the core of what was being proposed. How did the program work in practice? I'm not going to belabor all of the details, but basically the program was, at least during this period, largely voluntary. And what they did was they created, in each of these 900 or more settlements, identical public institutions. So these were really carbon copy villages. They all had the same set of institutions. And importantly, perfect equality, right? Everybody was given the same plot of the same size land. Their houses looked identical to each other, and everything was allocated by lottery. Okay, so you're shutting down class divisions. And so what's left in these communities that differentiated them from each other? The people, right? Different levels of diversity, which is going to vary a lot across communities for a variety of reasons that I won't go into details here, but we're going to see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the ethnic mix in these villages. Okay? Now, just to give you a sense of how much diversity this program created, here is a distribution of fractionalization, right? Remember the probability that any two residents of a village are from a different ethnic group. Most villages, you can see, have very low levels of diversity, very low fractionalization. Here's what transmigration villages look like. Much more diverse, right? And you see the same thing for polarization, right? You're just creating much more diverse villages than what would happen if you just let people move around and villages created organically, as they have been throughout history. Now, in thinking about nation building, there are lots of things we can measure, and we do measure a lot of them, but we're going to focus on language first and foremost, okay? We all know the history of the Indonesian language. Very few people spoke it in 1930 when the independence movement was said, we're gonna choose this as our national language in the Declaration of Unity in 1928. Today, or a decade ago, and I bet today it's even higher, almost everyone in Indonesia can speak Indonesian. Okay? That's not surprising. What is maybe more surprising is that there's a lot of variation in who is reporting to the BPS enumerators and the census penduduk, who's reporting that they speak Indonesian as their main language at home, not their ethnic language. 18% of the country was reporting that in 2010. If you go to Jakarta, almost everybody is saying they speak Indonesian as their main language at home. Okay? And if you look at the Asia Barometer, what you see is that people who speak Indonesian at home are reporting that they feel a much stronger attachment to their Indonesian identity as opposed to their ethnic identity. Okay? And that's consistent with one of the early leaders of language policy in Indonesia, Ali Jabana, who said that the more that our population learns to express themselves in Indonesian, the more conscious they'll become of the ties which link them together. Okay? Now, if you look at the IFLS, the Indonesia Family Life Survey, you see that people who grew up in a household speaking Indonesian as the main language at home, when those kids grow up and start their own families and households, they are also more likely to speak Indonesian at home. They're also less attached to their ethnic identity. They're more likely to kind of change what they report as their ethnic identity. And that's, of course, happening in households where people have spouses from a different ethnicity, where you have interethnic marriage. And they're also more likely to trust other ethnic groups. Okay, so in general, when you're using Indonesian as a child, as the main language at home for socialization, you see weaker ethnic attachment later in life. Okay, so why does this matter for thinking about diversity? So what I'm going to show you now is this is just kind of the raw data, right? Looking at different transmigration villages, and we're going to ask, how do polarization and fractionalization affect Indonesian use as the main language at home, okay? And we think about that as a strong signal of being invested in the national identity. Okay, so let's take one village, Tanjung Dumai in Riau. It's a transmigration village. It's basically entirely Javanese, okay? What do you think they're speaking at home? Javanese. Nobody is speaking Indonesian at home in this village, okay? And this is in 2010, okay? What about Tanjung Gading in Lampung, okay? This is a very diverse village. In fact, its level of diversity is very comparable to Jakarta, okay? What are they speaking at home? Indonesian. 95% of people are telling the enumerator, and we're speaking Indonesian at home, okay? What about Bukit Kemuning, also in Lampung, not far away from Tanjung Gading, right? And in this village, it's also similarly kind of median levels of polarization, but much less fractionalization, less diversity, fewer groups, majority Javanese. They have lower levels of Indonesian use at home, only about a quarter of households. Okay? What about a village, Tridharma Wirajaya in South Sumatra? Similar level of diversity in terms of fractionalization, but much more polarized. Why more polarized? Because there's one large group, the Javanese, and one large minority group, the Sundanese. And in this village, very few people are speaking Indonesian at home. They're really entrenched in their ethnic identities and speaking their ethnic languages at home. Okay, and if you look at the data kind of at large, you see a similar pattern. It's really the villages that have very high levels of fractionalization, lower levels of polarization, where you're seeing very high levels of Indonesian use at home. These are communities where national identity is very strong, okay? So that's for language, but we see similar patterns if you look at other measures. We ask people, how much do you trust other ethnic groups? We ask people, what name, you see what names they're giving their children. Their names appear to be less evocative or signaling of ethnic identity and more inclusive. You see higher levels of interethnic marriage, less conflict, more public goods, okay? So many small groups, relatively few large groups, that's conducive to national integration. Okay, and there are a lot of interesting mechanisms that can help explain these patterns, but the kind of main takeaway is that we can think about identity formation and the growth of national identity is something that happens over time. It happens through the decisions that parents are making about what language to speak at home, right? And they're making these decisions based on who's living around them in their community. Okay, and so it's this intergenerational process of change through intergroup contact. All right, and in fact, what can happen over time as more people are using the Indonesian language is that it can bring people together. It can reduce the level of difference between different ethnic groups, right? Because if there's no longer a language barrier separating us, then we can think about our group as being much closer to each other. And that's what we're showing in this graph. You see a shift from the kind of inherited ethnic identities and diversity that implies to one that is even less polarized as we're speaking the same language and feeling less alienated. Okay? So just to kind of give you a couple of takeaways from this work, it's really the particular ethnic mix in these communities that's most important, okay? And polarization really leads to kind of an entrenchment into your ethnic group, whereas fractionalization, really many small groups can encourage people to integrate through a common third identity, in this case, the Indonesian identity. Okay, and so we can think about both residential and resettlement policies as vehicles for managing diversity in societies with lots of different groups. Okay, so that was a study focused on understanding how to bring people to more diverse places, right? And kind of foster diversity by moving people, right? Now what I want to do is think about another very common policy in the era of decentralization, pemekaran daerah, and think about how that process has also affected diversity, not by moving people, but by creating new places with different configurations of diversity. Okay? So in economics, we have some famous theories that tell us that people can vote with their feet. If you don't like where you live because of who's living around you, you can move somewhere else that's more representative for you. But what if people can't move? We know there are lots of barriers to movement, right? What if people can't move? Well, let's move the place to the people. How do we do that? We redraw political boundaries. Okay, and that's exactly what's happened, not just here in Indonesia with pemekaran daerah, but all over the world. Right? This is something happening everywhere. Okay, and this process can really change the incentives for different groups in society to build coalitions together. Okay, why is that? Because there's lots of new resources that are coming into places where you're building new local governments. Okay, and if we think about what's happening in the process of redrawing boundaries, you're changing the composition of voters, of the electorate. Okay, and in some cases, you're going to increase the homogeneity of the electorate, and that can reduce violence, sure. But in other cases, the way you redrew the boundaries might create incentives for new types of kind of ethnic divisions or religious divisions in that locality. Okay, and we'll see examples of that. And you know what we do is try and test these two competing mechanisms in the context of Indonesia. Sorry. It's a slight delay. So, I don't need to belabor the history. You're all a young group here, but surely this is not unfamiliar terrain for you in the decentralization era, right? There was a kind of massive proliferation of new kabupaten around the country. You can see that here. If you look at a graph of the number of new districts that were, or this is the number of districts, and you can see in gray the study period that we're focusing on, just this massive increase in the number of kabupaten. And this is happening everywhere. Of course, it's more pervasive in the outer islands, but it's really happening all over the country. What does this look like in practice? Well, here's an example. Again, this is something familiar to the audience, but just to remind ourselves, what does pemekaran daerah mean? It means taking an original kabupaten, like Manggarai and NTT, okay, and then splitting Manggarai up into a parent district that retains the original district capital, the original government institutions, and then creating a new child district, in this case Manggarai Barat, that gets a new district capital, okay? And so there's, because of the way the policy was designed, it actually provides us with a nice opportunity to estimate the effects of both splitting on conflict, but also on kind of how the changes in diversity are affecting conflict, okay? And again, there was a lot to contest. Why is there going to be conflict? Well, just like in any context, there's resources that are being fought over by different groups in society. And this was a case where building that new local government really led to a big increase in public resources that could be contested. Okay? I've listed some examples here. And then, of course, there's new elections. There's new bupatis. There's new resources to go around and be allocated by this powerful new executive in the mayor's office. Now, what's going to happen to ethnic divisions, right? Here's just two very stylized examples, and then I'll give you two real-world examples, okay? One thing that could happen is we have an original district, A, where there are two groups equally split in terms of their size. This is a very polarized district, right? We split them up and give them each their own kabupaten, sorry. In that case, there's a big reduction in diversity. right? Much more homogeneous, much less polarization. Here's an alternative example where you have a kabupaten that has one large group, majority group X, and then two minority groups that are equal size. This district splits up. The group X, the majority, gets their own homogeneous kabupaten, and then the child district, the two get the two minority groups. Okay? Before splitting, those minority groups, maybe they were allied. They were a minority coalition. After splitting, there's new government resources to fight over, and these two groups could now be in competition with each other, right? So in practice, this is exactly what happened in Indonesia. You have some kabupaten, like number 1, and some kabupaten, like number 2, okay? But to give you an example of, from concrete example, this is just kind of the details of how we construct the changes in diversity with the new boundaries. But let me just show you a map with the actual examples, okay? So here's the original kabupaten of Aceh Tenggara, okay? And you can see in the different colors, in the map, we've colored each village, each desa, based on the ethnic group in that desa, okay? And you can see that Orang Gayo are all in the north of Aceh Tenggara, okay? And then in the south, you have a mix of Alas and Batak Tapanuli and Toba and Singkil, etc., okay? This was a case where it was very clear. Let's draw the new boundary. You can see the thick dashed line. That's where they drew the boundary. And as a result, this district saw a massive reduction in polarization, okay? Because now the Gayo are in the homogeneous new district, and the Alas and a few other groups are in a relatively homogeneous district in the south, okay? Here's an alternative example that fits under that number 2 bucket, okay? This is Kota Waringin Timur in Kalimantan. Here they split into 3 kabupaten, and in this case, they did create some kabupaten that were more homogeneous, right? But in general, look at the map. It's just like, it looks like a mosaic, right? A kaleidoscope of groups. How could they have possibly created a homogeneous set of new kabupaten? It would have been very difficult to do that because of the rules about how to create the new kabupaten from underlying kecamatan. And so in this case, they did reduce fractionalization a little bit, which happens kind of mechanically, but you actually saw an increase in polarization, okay? This is just a map showing those changes for all of the kabupaten across Indonesia, lots of variation, right? But here is a kind of headline result, okay? So this is looking at the change in polarization, right, against the change in social conflict. These are episodes of violence that are reported in local media. Okay, in some cases, people are actually being injured and killed, but in a lot of cases, it's just kind of political violence or riots that are happening, in the kabupaten capital. But what this is showing is that kabupaten that split and became more polarized see an increase in conflict. Okay. For fractionalization, you don't see much happening. It's really about polarization. Because when you're in a polarized kabupaten, you want to make sure that your group wins, right? What do you want to make sure they win? Well, you want to make sure they win the election, right? And not the DPR day election. That's important. But what's the DPR? The DPR has proportional representation, right? Different groups get different representatives proportional to their size, if that's how the coalitions work, right? But the Bupati election, there's a lot at stake in those elections, right? And you want to make sure that your group wins in that polarized context, right? Because you're setting the policies. You're determining the resources that are being allocated and spent, okay? So if we think about the kind of lessons from this study, it is shedding some important light on this very popular decentralization policy, right? That itself can be a tool for managing diversity. And we highlight some kind of potential and promise, but also some pitfalls, Okay, and I'd say, there's a lot more to learn about pemekaran. It's obviously not happening at the same pace that it did 5, 10, 20 years ago, but it's still very important. And there's a lot to learn about kind of the longer term effects of this important policy change. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and get some water. Yeah. But can I ask how are we doing on time? Okay, all right. Wonderful. So thank you very much. So we've been talking a lot about ethnicity, right? Obviously, a very important source of diversity in Indonesia. There are also other important dimensions of diversity, right? Religion is obviously an incredibly important one that, look on paper, of course, 90% or so, maybe a little bit less of the Indonesian population is Muslim, but there's a lot of variation in views within the Muslim population. The different aliran historically and today, and you see that in showing up in different forms. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of today is a couple of different studies that highlight an important role for religion in shaping the nation building process here in Indonesia. Okay? So the first is going to focus on a very tumultuous period in the 1960s, okay? And focus in particular on a policy by former President Sukarno that tried to redistribute land in an effort to mitigate some of the class divisions that were very pervasive in post-independence Indonesia. And what we're going to see is that as a result of a variety of forces, but importantly, the role of Islamic institutions in helping large landowners evade expropriation, we're going to see a process by which an attempted land reform to reduce class divisions actually led to an amplification of other divisions along the religious divide. Okay, and we'll see over the long run that this failed land reform set in motion a process that gave power to religious politics and set them in competition with the secular state. Okay, and then secondly, we'll see the very well-known mass schooling program, M.Int.Dev.Ec in the New Order under President Suharto. And here we'll see actually Islamic schools, the large Islamic education sector, are competing with the state as the government is building public schools, but that they're also potentially complementing the state's effort and leading to more education for Indonesian citizens, but also potentially more higher levels of religiosity as a result of religious education system. Okay? All right. So religious politics are not unique to Indonesia. Of course, they're very important in the US. You can see this today, but they're important everywhere. And in fact, there's a lot of questions about whether we're seeing kind of a rise in religious politics that in a new way. After the fall of communism, we saw a rise in religious politics as kind of socialism and communism decline. But you're seeing this happening even today in new forms, right? In both the Christian, the Muslim, the Jewish, the Hindu world, all over, really, even in the Buddhist world. Okay? And of course, religious politics featured very prominently in 2019. And of course, 2024, the election you just had, was different. Okay, to give you a sense of, here's some images, of course, famous images from the protests against former governor of Jakarta, Ahok, very well known. But to give you a sense of at least the Western press, I've taken snippets from newspapers. This is from the 2019 elections, and you can see religious polarization was very high in the 2019 election. It featured very prominently, right? And then in 2024, things were completely different, okay? And there are a lot of reasons for that, some that I'm just starting to understand and having conversations with people who know the political landscape here much better than I do. But there's a lot of interesting things happening. But what's important, and what we're going to tackle in this study is how is it that by 2019, religious political forces had gained so much power and momentum, and are shaping the kind of political landscape in important ways. Okay? Now, of course, this tension over the future of the Indonesian state and the kind of role of religion versus other political forces, this is not new, right? Here are some images from the post-independence era, right? But again, this goes back to the early 1900s. You had Syarikat Islam in the early 1900s. You had the PKI. You had the nationalist, secular nationalist movement. And they all had different visions for Indonesia, right? And that continued into the post-independence era. And what happened in the 1960s, Sukarno tried to implement a land reform that would mitigate the class divisions, okay? And in practice, what we're going to see is that attempted land reform ultimately ended up empowering Islamic organizations and institutions that had previously not had as much political and economic resources at their disposal. Okay, we're going to focus on the Waqf, which is, of course, a well-known charitable institution, the quintessential charitable institution in Islamic law. And this is a really important institution, one that lots of political scientists and economists are trying to understand its historical and modern legacy. And what we're going to do is study how the land reform shaped the spread of Waqf institutions and the role that those institutions played in empowering the Islamist movement in Indonesia. Okay, so how are we able to do this? Well, in the 1960s, that land reform, the Basic Agrarian Law, it had a loophole. It said if the land was held by religious institutions, it would not be subject to expropriation. So a lot of large landowners transferred their land into Waqf endowments, managed by religious authorities in their communities, okay? And what's important about the Waqf? It's inalienable. It cannot be taken away. Its purpose cannot be changed. It is effectively stuck at what the original document established. And so that meant that after the land reform was undone and it failed, the Waqf stuck. Land may have been kind of redistributed back to some of the owners if it was expropriated, but not the Waqf endowments. Okay, and so for a variety of reasons, there's variation in the extent of expropriation and the pressure on large landowners to transfer their land into Waqf status. Okay, so what happened? Okay, this is a study that was done at the Kabupaten level, and what we're measuring is, you can think of as the threat of expropriation, okay? What is that threat doing? It's encouraging large landowners to transfer their land into religious hands, okay? That increased the prevalence of Waqf endowments that we see even in the early 2000s. What are Waqf endowments doing? They're supporting masjid, they're supporting Islamic schools, especially pesantren. And that's what you see here. You see in the 1960s and especially in the thereafter, you see this growth in pesantren and masjid construction in places with a greater threat of expropriation. Okay? So that's just kind of a first stage, right? What happened when you empower religious organizations with resources? Lots of things could change, right? But what we then see is that there's growing support for Islamist parties, right? For parties like P3, okay? In the New Order era, and then after the New Order era, parties like PKS, even PPB, etc. Okay? And then what happened? You've got decentralization, right? What happens in decentralization? Local governments can decide to implement Perda Sharia. They can decide to expand the role of Islamic courts. And then there are, of course, lots of non-state actors like FPI and other organizations that might be empowered by some of these changes locally. Okay, and so this is happening, in the decentralization era, many years after the land reform. But you also see voters. This isn't just kind of elites imposing their will. Voters are demanding in these areas, they're demanding these types of policies. Okay, and you see this showing up in a number of surveys and local perda, but you also see legislative candidates for DPRD in these areas. They're running on more religious platforms. Religion is playing a bigger role in politics in these places. But interestingly, you're not seeing a change in religiosity. So you're not seeing people becoming more religious, more intensely religious in their day-to-day lives, but they're just changing the way that they think religion should matter for local politics and local policies. Okay? There are also some important economic consequences of transferring land into Waqf status that we find, but it's much more limited than what others have found in the Middle Eastern context. Okay? So just very briefly, those are some regressions that, are subject to various interpretations. It's also important to kind of go and ground truth your regressions. So here's one example of a very famous pesantren in Indonesia called Guntur. Okay, some of you have surely heard of it. The history of this institution is fascinating, but importantly, during the 1960s, they received a massive transfer of land from various elite landowners, trying to protect their land from expropriation by the government. And this really increased the endowment, the Waqf endowments and the resources for Guntur. And for those who know Guntur, it's Nur Wahid's from there, an alumni from there, lots of famous leaders of the Islamist movement in Indonesia. It's a very important institution in thinking about religious politics. At least it was in the lead up to the 2019 election. Here's a picture of the leaders of Guntur and President Jokowi. And then, of course, things were again different in 2024. Here's Nur Wahid saying, we don't want any politicians or political candidates visiting Guntur this time. Okay, things changed, right? And that's really interesting. None of these things are persistent forever. There's a possibility of change. Okay, so some final lessons, and then I'll tell you about the mass schooling program if I still have a little bit of 15 minutes. Okay, great. So I hope I'm not talking too fast, but let me just kind of give you some headline takeaways from this study, and then we'll talk about SD and Prez. Okay? So this is an example of a policy, a very popular one, land reform, to mitigate the divisions between classes, high and lower class in Indonesia, right? What did that do in practice? It actually activated another set of divisions between more conservative and less conservative religious forces. Okay? And another important lesson is that religious politics as we know it here in Indonesia and maybe in many other places, it's not something that's necessarily deeply connected to religiosity, the strength of religious conviction and values, but it's also very importantly connected to the power of religious institutions and the resources that they have to implement policies, to mobilize voters, etc. And in the decentralization era, right, this opens the door for religious entrepreneurs to change policy in ways that were not possible when everything was centralized and there was very limited scope for local policymakers and the local organizations and the communities that influence them to change the political landscape. Okay? There's also other interesting questions about the future of kind of religious forces here in Indonesia and elsewhere, what role technology might be playing in kind of shaping their strength. And it's also really interesting to think, especially in the Indonesian context, but also elsewhere in the Muslim world, what governments might be doing to kind of divide and conquer, for lack of a better term, the different forces within the religious populations, right? Is there a way to kind of force moderates and conservatives to kind of compete with each other rather than competing with the state? Okay, so finally, in the last little bit of time, what I'm going to do is tell you about, and this is the newest of the studies I've listed here and we've talked about today. This is a study trying to understand the role of religious education in an era of mass schooling. Mass schooling is something that almost every country in the world has implemented in their history, where you try and build public schools and get the population to universal primary schooling, okay? Now, we can take a step back though. We're gonna talk about education, but we can also think beyond education. The process of economic development is a process where the state steps in and tries to start providing public goods and building the capacity to do that. But if you look at various domains of public good provision, there's lots of incumbent providers that are informal and have been around for decades or centuries, also providing public goods. And they might not react kindly to the government coming in from the center and imposing their will. So we'll see this in the context of education, but this also is important in thinking about tax collection, important in thinking about the court system, medicine. There's traditional medicine providers that interact, might be countering the role of modern medicine providers. Thinking about security provision, money lenders, right? The list goes on. But it's really important in the context of education, where historically, if you look at Europe, for example, the early pioneers in mass schooling, there was always tensions with the church, right? The church had lots of religious schools, and those schools were often in confrontation with new public schools that the government was building. Okay, and so it's important to ask, how do religious schools respond to mass schooling interventions by the government? Okay, and that's what we're going to look at in this project. And here in Indonesia, as we know, there's a dual education system where Islamic education remains very, very important to this day. Almost a quarter of all Indonesian students have at some point in their educational lives, at least the ones currently enrolled, been in an Islamic school of some form, okay? And we also know that there was a famous mass schooling program in the New Order era, Sekolah Dasar Impres, when the Suharto government built more than 60,000 public primary schools. Esther Duflo, Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote a famous paper on the human capital impacts of this program and the returns in the labor market. Much less attention has been given to the political context of this program, right? This was part of a bigger package of policies that were meant to homogenize and really try and secularize national education in Indonesia. And what we're going to look at is how the Islamic sector responded. Okay? Of course, all of you know the kind of landscape of religious schooling in Indonesia. Lots of schools like this historically that were run very independently from the government, right? And then in the 1970s, President Suharto, seen there in one of the SD Impres schools, wearing the traditional batik shirt, the uniforms among the students, right? Very distinct from the kind of picture one would see at an Islamic school, right? Or some types of Islamic schools. And his government really viewed education as the kind of key vehicle for promoting national unity, right? First through that instruction in Pancasila, but also through the national language, through Bahasa Indonesia, okay? At the time, a lot of Muslim leaders viewed this program as an attempt to weaken the status of Islamic education, okay? And this was happening in a context that perception was not kind of out of the ordinary, given the history leading up to that point. Right? There was a lot of efforts to force Islamic schools to reduce the time spent teaching religious curricula. And this happened at various points under Sukarno. And then, it kind of bubbled up in the early 1970s. And as part of the debate between Islamic leaders and the Suharto regime. Okay, so what do we find? We actually find that the mass construction of SD across Indonesia, it actually led to an increase in the construction of Islamic schools. Okay, so these are madrasa and pesantren. Okay, so you see in places where they built more SD, you see more Islamic schools being built, even within the same village. We went and conducted some oral histories in some of these villages, and some of the local leaders of these Islamic schools, the founders of these schools, told us they would literally build the madrasa like 200 meters from the SD just to kind of force the competition for parents to kind of make their decision. Okay, but what we also see is that in the madrasa that were built in this competitive environment, at least what we can see today in terms of their curriculum on the SIAP platform, you can see that these schools today are still offering more religious curricula than schools that were built before SD-INPRES, or schools that were built, Islamic schools that were built in environments with less competition from SD. You also saw, as part of this process, a formalization. You saw a shift from pesantren, the more, at least in the 70s, more informal Islamic educational institutions, to the madrasa, more formal ones. Why is that? Well, you also want to ensure that the students graduating from the madrasa ibtidaiya, if they want to go on to SMPs, then they can have that credential, which they wouldn't have had they gone to a pesantren. So this is part of that competitive response, right? And so what you see at the individual level is that at the primary level, at the level of elementary school, you do see that fewer kids in that early 1970s and later in the 1970s period, fewer students are going to Islamic elementary schools, to madrasa ibtidaiya. Okay, but here's where it gets interesting. You actually see more students in those exposed cohorts going to madrasa sanawiya, right, and madrasa aliyah, right? So they're getting educated in the SD, and then the Islamic leaders in these communities, they're building the MTS and the MA, and then the students graduating from SD are going on to get Islamic education, right? And so in the end, what you see is that you actually see that SD-INPRES, in these intense areas of school construction, increased exposure to Islamic schooling, right? It would be great to go back and be able to talk to President Suharto and his team and ask whether they expected this to happen. I suspect that they probably didn't. But this just gives you a sense of the kind of nature of competition between religious and more secular educational institutions. Okay, and these are just some graphs kind of showing this, the pattern empirically of what I just described. But the final thing we do in this paper is try to understand the consequences, right? For things that Professor Ediono thinks about, and like what is curriculum doing in terms of shaping identity and ideology. Okay, and so in fact, we find some very interesting patterns. We find that in the short run, in places where they built more SD-INPRES, you actually saw a reduction in support for Golkar in the elections later in the 1970s and in the early 1980s. Where did those votes go? Some of them went to PDI, but a lot of them went to P3, right? And so that suggests that there might have been a little bit of a backlash. But in the long run, you're not seeing kind of a big shift in demand for religious politics, for example, right? What you are seeing is that the kids who were educated in this competitive environment, when religious and secular schools were competing in their communities, those children are growing up with higher levels of religiosity, right? They're more adherent, they're practicing the Islamic faith much more in a much more adherent way. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, I think there is backlash. It's clear from some of our results, but at the same time, there's also complementarities, right? The Islamic sector is building middle schools and high schools, right? In order to capture those public primary school graduates, those new graduates, new cohorts of students who are finishing primary school and want to keep going to school. But the government didn't build enough SMPs to be able to accommodate all of those students. And so instead, they're going to Madrasah Sanawiyas and Madrasah Aliyas, right? And in the end, the Indonesian population is becoming more educated, higher levels of education, but also more religious, right? And that's really interesting in comparing Indonesia to the rest of the world. Okay, this is just summarizing, a lot of what we've already described, but let me just describe this graph very briefly because I think it's very instructive. So I don't know how many of you know this, but if you look at the kind of survey data, Indonesia is one of the most religious countries in the world. Just based on asking people, how important is religion in your life, right? Indonesia is one of the most religious in the world. It's also one of the few countries, which this graph is showing, one of the few countries in the world where more educated people are more religious. If you look at it's hard to see on the graph, but if you look at the countries at the bottom, the US, France, Turkey, a lot of European countries, these are countries where more educated people are less religious, right? And that's the norm. Right? And why is that the norm? Because in many countries historically, mass schooling has led to a complete disruption and displacement of religious education. In Indonesia and in a number of other countries, that didn't happen. You have these dual education systems, right? And so you see that it is possible to have higher levels of education and more economically advanced and developed countries move hand in hand with more religiosity, right? Okay, so I summarized 4 studies on Indonesia that I've done with some amazing co-authors, and there's lots more that I could tell you about. But what I want to do in the last couple minutes is just give you a sense of kind of my vision of the future of the research and policy landscape in thinking about nation building. So if you look around the world, there's lots of conflict, not necessarily violent, social and political conflict about distributive issues. How do we allocate resources and power in society, right? What else do we see when we look around? Lots of cultural divisions, right? This happens in different ways in different places, right? In the US, it's really like liberal and conservative, Republican and Democrat, but it takes very different forms in different countries, right? But these are on the rise everywhere, rich and poor countries. And these tensions can really undermine policymaking in many ways, but especially in terms of thinking about development, where we need to create conditions of stability to foster investment and foster the kind of trust necessary for markets to work well. Okay, and I think there's a very rich and exciting history that is just waiting to be unearthed and illuminated and connected to the present. Much of what we see around us today and think, oh man, how did things, why does it look like this? Why are things so conflictual, so much tension in society? Much of that is not new. And it's incumbent upon us as social scientists to understand the kind of history that got us to where we are today. And I think economists have much to contribute and learn from other social sciences. And I think, Professor Mubyarto's work is a testament to this. He was an economist, but he took social and cultural issues very seriously and thought about how they interacted with economic decision making and development. Okay, so just to kind of put up at on the very last slide, just a couple of things that I think all of us in this room should be thinking about in terms of the future of research. I think thinking about the role of print and digital media in the historical and kind of modern nation building process, thinking about how technology is going to change nation building dynamics. Technology in terms of AI, but in terms of before that, the internet, social media, etc. And also thinking about what is going to happen as the world becomes older, as populations age. How's that going to shape the divide between the young and the old? And how are the young populations going to innovate in these aging societies? And then I think, there's a lot to learn about the way that we teach history, right? It's so important how you learn about your country, its role in the world. And this is really kind of important for understanding how we build national narratives, right? And those narratives are going to change and they evolve. And understanding that and empirically trying to kind of study that, I think is important. And then here's a very important one, as IKN is all over the news, thinking about the location of the capital city, right? How is that going to change the distribution of resources, access to the center of power, political power? How might that change nation building dynamics? Okay, and I'm just leaving up here at the end a list of some of my own projects that are continuing to think about a lot of these issues, and here in Indonesia primarily, but also in other contexts. I just want to end by expressing my deep and sincere gratitude again to the organizers for kindly inviting me. This is a great honor for me to be up here. I've been working in Indonesia for more than almost 20 years now. I love your country, I love your people, and it's really wonderful to be here. And I'm really honored to have a discussion from our esteemed colleagues, Jahen and Ryan. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Sam. It was very interesting. And also, I'm sure that we all here have already got a lot of things to think about from what Sam just explained to us. All right, and for the next session, it's for our discussants, Pak Rian and Pak Jahen. So the time is for you. Which one is going to go first? All right, please.
All right. Thank you for being here. And first of all, I need to say my gratitude for the organizers for entrusting me to be one of the discussants for this event. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give my opinions and discussing some of the things that we have listened from Sam regarding nation building. And the first thing that I want to say is like a summary of research. Actually, this is one, these slides are taken from Sam's presentation at Melbourne, probably blatantly copied from his presentation. But here, again, I'm just summarizing his research, particularly for the four research that he has done and he has also presented. First, for example, regarding population resettlement, the transmigration program, Sam and his colleagues found that after 15 to 30 years of resettlement, polarization seems to increase ethnic attachment, but on the other hand, fractionalizations increases national identity and integration. So we have these two measures of ethnic diversity that seems to have like different directions in terms of nation building. His second research is on redrawing admin boundaries, which is decentralisasi, pemekaran, and so on. And it seems that district splitting has no effect on conflict on average, but conflict falls in places that homogenize. And again, similar to the previous finding, they found that polarization amplifies conflict. And this, again, a feature that that happens prominently in many research, and I'm going to talk more about polarization versus fractionalization later on in my talk. The third study was on land reform, where they found that in the 1960s, land reform created a threat of expropriations, increased wakaf prevalence. And fourthly is on mass schooling. I'm trying my best to not mispronounce this, another terms. But the in-press school, the SD in-press school, seem to did not crowding out Islamic schools, but increases Islamic piety and religious identity. So that's basically in the summary of Sam's presentation. So there is nothing new from what I presented here. Now I have 5 points to discuss. The first thing is I want to start with a quote from Herbert Faith there, where in the creation of a nation, people enthusiastically severing its outworn ties to local traditions, and that the first task was the destruction of ethnic barriers and the creation in society at large. And my question for this quote is that, is it really have to be in opposite direction? Is there any kind of middle ground where the process of nation building can be hand in hand with, let's say, me, for example, being half Japanese, half Buginese? How can I still be proud of my ethnic identities while still believe in the continuation of this national building project? And again, Sam's in his 2019 paper have built a very good model, economic theorist model, that relates intergroup contact with nation building. And again, this is the theory, and also been empirically shown that fractionalizations with having a lot of small groups is actually hastens or have a positive association with national building, whereas polarizations hinders national building. The second thing that I want to discuss is I want to start here from the quote from Pak Mubyarto and Prof. Aceh Pardadireja. I believe it was published in BS as well in 1968, so it's I know, almost 50 years ago. The quote here is related with the transmigration program, with the resettlement program. In this article, Pak Mubi and Pak Aceh said that in general, the transmigration program is a piecemeal undertaking from which not much can be expected. So it is interesting remark from the 2 professors from UGM. And the question will be is, okay, transmigration is, I think Sam have already been discussing before, that is a controversial program. At what cost then are we going to promote objective of this national building program? The objective of national building is to create cohesion and inclusion. And more importantly, I believe, is that when we're talking about national building, when we're talking about the identity of being Indonesian, do we know that being Indonesian is like the best thing? Maybe it's like a controversial take here, but why don't we go to something else? Why don't we choose different kind of national identity that we believe to be like and also one term here that I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with, the NKRI harga mati. It's something that obviously can be misused to promote national building while at the same time suppressing those who may have different opinion about it. The third topic is on the importance of ethnic diversity. I have the opportunity to attend Chris Blackman's presentation in 2019 at Göttingen University. I don't have the slides, I don't have the record, but I still remember he said that basically he is pessimistic, or he doesn't have like much belief on the importance of this ethnic diversity aspect in conflict research. But then if we look at Sam's presentation, he weaved a theory where the two can somehow have impact on national building. And in 2022 paper, actually Chris and Sam joined hand in writing a paper on conflict prediction. So that's that. And one thing that I want to touch here is on the association between ethnic diversity and social capital. And this is important because national building as a core inputs to micro foundation of trust and macro foundation of stability, and trust is one aspect of social capital. And again, here I'm reiterating the importance of gotong royong. It's also from Pak Mubi and Pak Aceh's paper in 1968. And again, SAMs have discussed about this on the effect of polarization and fractionalization on social capital in these transmigration villages. And my own research also found like a slightly different thing. Because in Sam's article, it focuses on transmigration villages, but in my own research, it's more on the general population, where it seems that polarization and fractionalizations increase with certain types of social capital, which is tolerance, but decrease with particularized trust. The fourth one is I also believe to be one of the tenets in national building, where we are focusing on the impact of, let's say, ethnic conflict. So I believe all of us are quite familiar with the issue of ethnic conflict, particularly in the early 2000s, where we experienced a lot of ethnic or religious hostilities in Aceh, Sampit, and so on. And there have been a lot of research conducted on this topic. For example, one that I did was in 2019 about the long-term effect of ethnic conflict in Aceh on behavior, and also another study by Werner and Lambsdorff in 2019 in post-conflict Ambon. And I believe that in the process of building a nation, the way the society react or adapt to the policy of post-conflict policy is also going to be an important thing. Finally, it's more on the theories. I'm not sure all of everyone here are interested in theory, but basically there is only one big theory, apart from SAMS, of course, on conflict and ethnic diversity. For example, in the Esteban and Ray 2011 paper, the three measures of ethnic diversity, polarization, fractionalization, and the Greenberg-Gini index, together they be able to predict the equilibrium per capita conflict. But the theory is basically focusing on big, large conflict like civil war. But we understand that since mid-2000, Indonesia is no longer in big conflict. Instead, we have experienced a high frequency of small conflict. And there is some things that we can do in terms of developing another theory, perhaps, that can explain the prevalence of this small-scale conflict. And finally, here I'm just going to point out some future research in the issue of nation building. For example, in terms of topic, post-conflict behavioral research, I believe to be something important, and this can be done, for example, through lab-in-the-field experiments, which I also mentioned there in the methods or theory part. Second one is on intergroup distance, non-ethnic in particular. It's not just between group, it's not just intergroup between, let's say, Islam and Catholic or Protestant or Hindu or etc. But even within the same religions, there can be some, differences. People who are affiliated with NU and Muhammadiyah may have different behavior, for example, and also topics on current or modern Islamic development. I saw Mas Pugo here attending this event, and he did an excellent survey on mosque. So I believe that's going to be one of the area where we can learn, because if we're gonna, it's gonna be really interesting to see whether and how development in the areas where the mosque is and whether the amount of resources flowing into this religious institution may have impact to the surrounding community. In terms of methods, of course, as I said before, in the discussion number 5 is like theories or micro-foundation of small-scale conflict. And also, I'm not sure with this second point is when we measure ethnic diversity, we basically rely on population census. It's 10 years, it's only conducted every 10 years. So there will be some limitations on that, unless we assume that there is no change within that 10 years in terms of ethnic diversity. So I think we need to think more about this alternative measure of diversity. Finally, in terms of data, we have a lot of data that we can utilize, administrative data, and also event or geo-reference data, such as from ECLID. Okay, thank you. I think that's all of my discussion for Sam's presentation, and thank you for listening.
Hello, tes. Oke. Alright, selamat siang semua. Good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thanks for the invitation. So I think it's an honor for me here. Hello, tes. Yeah. It is an honor for me to be here because, again, I'm not from UGM, but I think the name of Prof. Mubyarto has been always mentioned by Prof. Dorjatun in our class, the history of economic thought, and also by Pak Faisal Bazzi in our class. So even though we have not been learned from the guru itself, but his name has been mentioning in our class. The second one is it's also been an honor for me to talk here or to respond to Sam's paper or research, because I think several years ago when I was a PhD student, I was trying to send an email to Sam discussing about the paper on Wakaf. I think at the time, Sam has only had these slides on that. And then as a PhD student, I just sent an email to him asking what is the progress of his paper at the time. And then I think from many professors or well-known people that I've sent an email, Sam was the one that willing to send a very long reply to an unknown PhD student. So I think if you want to be a lecturer in the future or become a prominent people in the future, you need to follow what Sam has been doing for people. So thanks for Sam for doing that. So what I'm going to do today is probably talking a little bit about what has been explained by Sam. Again, these are a very good paper, 4 of them published. 1 of them are still R&R, but 4 of them are really good papers. So if you're gonna do some empirical papers, you don't want to do survey, you can just follow what Sam and his co-author has done so far. So using several data set, employing very interesting and timely empirical method. Again, that's the first time I've learned about difference in discontinuity in his paper. So again, maybe Pak Gilang in his econometric lecture can also discuss what Sam has been doing in his study. All right. So what I'm going to do is first why we should know about nation building. Again, I think Sam has explained very in a good way about what is nation building. What I'm going to do is to reiterate what he has mentioned before, process of constructing or structuring a national identity using the power of the state. But what I think still missing here is what is the role of the military? Again, I'm gonna explain later on. There is a new paper from Development to Democracy written by 2 professors from, I forget their affiliation, but one of the key factors why Indonesia can introduce this nation building is because the role of this military. And also the role of Golkar party at the time, because again, it's the only party that has local branches in all regions in Indonesia. PPP doesn't have it, PDIP doesn't have it, and then that's also the reason why he can expose all of this policy. The purpose of nation building, again, promote social integration, because again, we have very diverse ethnicity, religions, cultures. It tries to promote political stability, and also by the end of the day, hopefully can create some economic development, right? But there are some challenges, again, because when we're talking about Indonesia, we've seen the map provided or shown by Sam. We are a very multi-ethnic religious country, and then it's difficult to manage these people, because Indonesians people are very difficult to be managed, right? So it is a challenge. What can be learned from Sam's paper, probably what are the key lessons that can be adopted in the future? So the challenge also requires some policy making inclusive and needs to address different objectives. So summary again, what he did is explain some issues about when it started, colonial era, independence, even the latest post-Suharto's regime, and also what are the policies that have been introduced by the government, transmigrasi, imposing Bahasa Indonesia as the common language, mass schooling, some new political administrative, and also the Wakaf paper. So I think there are several policies that have been, even though some intended and unintended policies that have been done by the government and leads to some several outcome in terms of the nation building. But what I'm trying to tell you today is what is the contribution of studies done by Sam and also his co-author. First is, again, he talked about or touch upon insight on nation building strategies. Again, he tries to really see some different policy interventions, which one is work, which one is doesn't. And again, the second point is very important. He uses very creative identification strategy and also uses a lot of different sources of data. So I think one of the editor of the economic journal, Sasha Becker, I think when I was again a PhD student, he mentioned that if you want to get your paper being published in a good journals, then you need to utilize several sources of data sets. You cannot rely just only from IFLS, but you need to combine it with the MOS data, the curriculum data, and all of this kind of data set. So you have a very robust paper. And what he did in his paper is basically try to see the impact of this development trajectory. So how these policy decisions have shaped Indonesia's social and economic development. Again, some key findings. I'm probably not gonna talk that much, but again, transmigration, it creates some diverse communities in the new settlements, some integrations, and then also in the language policy, Bahasa Indonesia, where people now use this common language as their home language in their home. Also, what we've seen from this mass schooling, it promotes national values. It also increased the number of Islamic schools, which tried to absorb the number of students that just finished their primary schools, and also the impact of this administrative boundary redrawing. So I guess this has been mentioned. But there are several issues, and Parian also highlighted several issues that probably gonna be the avenue for future research. First is, again, we are living in a very polarized world, and some persistent challenges occur in this highly polarized community. Again, maybe if we are living in urban areas, it's not really the case, but if we are going to villages where we have a very polarized community, then it is obviously becoming an issue. How persistent, again, Sam mentioned about whether it has a very long impact in the future. But again, if we are looking at the recent generations, I don't know whether nationalism is the case. We are becoming patriotic during the Olympic period. Or maybe that's the time when we are very proud. I don't know. This is maybe for me, but that's the time when we are becoming very patriotic. But in general daily life, we don't really see it in many generations. The second one is, I think studies about religious politics still remain understudied. And I think Sam has rightly pointed out there are many opportunities to study about this religious politics. I'm also doing one study on the impact of Islamic parties on several outcomes, even though it has been work in progress for almost 4 years. But again, there are still few studies in terms of what are the impact of religion on some economic outcome in Indonesia. And we have seen the rise of this religious and political influence due to historical policies, or because people are becoming more well informed. Because again, what we really understand from the history is or during Suharto's regime, it is forbidden to show your religious identity, right? So people cannot wear hijab, hijab in the class. Maybe the time of Islamic or religion studies were limited, but now people are well informed and can get any kind of source of information about religiosity. So whether this is because of the historical policies itself or because people are well informed with new information. The second point is, this is again what we have seen so far in several studies. People are becoming pious when they are getting older. And Indonesia, maybe in the next 20 or 30 years, we don't have this demographic dividend anymore, which probably gonna affect their religiosity, but does it really transmit into their kids? And will it affect some of their social behavior and so on and so forth? The third point that I think is also interesting, whether we really have this religious ideology or national identity. Because again, if you're looking at all of these political parties, Indonesia, they have both of this nationalism and also religious, right? So we don't really have a distinct difference between all of these political parties and which one play a significant role in our society. Again, this is really interesting to really know in the future. The third part that I think is also important to really know is about nation building and also nation destroying. This is from Leo Suryadinata seminal paper, where he has done several studies on nation destroying, and now we are seeing like some external factors that probably gonna affect our nation identity, right? Is globalizations, for instance, destroying the concept of a modern Indonesian nations? How about issues with ethnic minorities, where probably we have seen or we are still have limited knowledge on the role of Chinese Indonesian in Indonesia, and how does it affect our economy? Also, what we are seeing now is some horizontal conflict, even though Sam mentioned about we have a very few number of conflicts in Indonesia, but again, it has emerged several recently, and how does it affect, how it will affect our society and so on and so forth. So this is again, I don't know the answer, but it will be interesting to really look in the future. Now, these are the thing that maybe can also help us to really understand about the role of Suharto's. Again, this is a really good paper, a really good book by Dan Slater and Joseph Wong. So they explain why Indonesia that have similar characteristic with Thailand and also Myanmar can perform relatively well, and they introduce this developmental militarism. So the role of military in order to make sure that we are on the right track can probably explain why Indonesia relatively perform better compared to the other countries. But again, this is also an ongoing debate, because now we are seeing the role of military in the country have increased. So whether it is a good avenue or not, that will be a very interesting to see in the future. And finally, religious ideology. So this is the work that I've been working now. So we try to see the impact of Islamic parties on local development. Still work in progress. I don't know when I can finish it, but we are trying to see the impact of the role of Islamic parties, trying to complement what Sam and Mashur and Max have done. So we see that obviously some of these Islamic parties, which leads to some Islamic ideology, have some interesting impact on economic perspective. But unlike what Sam has found in his paper, we do see some effect of religiosity. So people who are living in district with Islamic mayors tend to become more pious, and they pray more, they are more religious. We also see some impact on corruption, but again, there are still many ways that you can be interested to study further. So that will be two things that I think really important. First is how we can really know the impact of the developmental militarism, and also study further on the impact of this religious identity. And again, I also want to highlight some potential research agenda. Again, technology's role, the impact of social media on national unity and identity. Again, how persistent is the transmission of nation building across different generations. That will be very interesting to see how different generations, like the millennial, generation Z, Y, Alpha, will behave differently because of this nation building. It is still remains unknown. Also, the recent reforms, there's so many education policies that have been introduced in the country. Again, we have LPDP. What is the role, long-term impact? Both of us got LPDP for our PhD, but we don't know whether we are very nationalistic after attending this PK, right? So there's no study on what is the impact of this PK on our nation building. That will be very interesting to see. And I know Sam is doing a research in IPDN, but now if you want to start as a civil servant, you have to do this prajabatan. I don't know whether it is really affect people on their nation building, or rasa Indonesian. But again, this is another avenue that can be studied further. In the past 10 years, we have heard about Nawacita, and now I think Astacita, a lot of citas now, cita-cita. But let's see how it goes, right? So a lot of things that have been done recently, so we can also see does it really affect our behavior, and other things like I'm working also on the role of Chinese Indonesians immigrant on the size of the firms, but we still have limited informations on this. Again, limited data, but if you want to push it there or study there about this topic, that will be very interesting. What drives religious identity in Indonesia, whether because of, again, well-informed people, well-educated, as Sam has mentioned, people are more well-educated, but they tend to be more pious. That is interesting to know. Again, which is stronger, religious or national identity? Because again, a latest paper by Kuipers et al., they are looking at the change of how parents give the names for their kids. So now Muslim parents tend to give more Arabic name to their kids now. So whether it also affects some nation identity or Indonesian identity. 3 last points. How do local leaders shape nation buildings? And it goes back to IPDN, because they are the really core people that have been trained in IPDN, whether they can transmit the things that they have learned in IPDN towards local people. I don't think we have it now. And all of these other factors, so the impact of external conflict, and why does Indonesia still maintain a relatively less occurrence of ethnic conflicts? Maybe because of this mining permit. I don't know. Maybe that's also interesting topic to be discussed further. So again, this is a very interesting topic. Again, there are a lot of room for improvement in the future. And I'm really sure that here from UGM, we're going to see the next Prof. Mubyarto. So hopefully this talk today done by Sam can inspire people to do more work on this very interesting topic. So thank you very much. Terima kasih.
All right, thank you Pak Rian and Pak Jahen. That was very interesting. Okay, now it's time for Q&A. If the audience have any question, please raise your hand. Okay, I will choose 3 first maybe ya. Bapak, ya silakan.
Good morning, Pak Sam. My name is Tony from Pusat Studi Ekonomi Kerakyatan, UGM. I want to dig your perspective. As we learned, Mubyarto is trained in United States, in Vanderbilt, in Iowa State, University. Um, can you explain how his thought from national building economic development is also rooted from American thinking of economic development, as we know that is somehow capitalism driven, right? And the second one is I want to dig your perspective also. As we know, Mubyarto has in the past has no it's limited friends in economists. His thought has been widely opposed, refuted by economists, but in the contrary, has more friends from the non-economists like anthropology, sociology, philosophy, historian, maybe some of the next generation like Pak Colin, Pak Colin, Pak Dumairi, Pak Refrison in the economic, but only a few generation. Maybe also hopefully Mas Rian, Mas Rezki has also the spirit to continue his struggle. What do you think? Is this happening also in the American, that the economists seem exclusive, seem very hard to make the science in order to struggle, in order to fight the economic justice and social justice? Thank you.
All right, do you want to answer first or should we collect more questions? Okay, maybe two more questions before the answer. Okay, so I need to go there so that everyone can have same opportunity. Please.
Good morning, Professor Bazzi. My name is Gifaria Prizal. I'm an economics student at UGM. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. I would like to ask a question in relation to globalization and the increase of immigration in search of a better life prospects. What is your perspective on the future of nation building and nationalism? In this context, how should we address the integration of immigration, particularly concerning the imposition of a third identity upon them? Thank you so much.
Okay, one more question from here. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Vibro from management. I have a question for Mr. Sam. Actually, I have a few questions, but first I'd like to ask, as a foreign researcher, have you seen parallels in Indonesia's development in national identity with other post-colonial states, and what can we potentially learn from them? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this first time. Let's take 3 questions, so please.
Test? Okay. Thanks very much. I'll tackle the questions in a moment. I just want to say thank you to Jahen and Rian for very thought-provoking discussion. I hope you can send me your slides so I can continue to mull over your great ideas. And yeah, I have lots of thoughts, but I want to get to the questions. But I just want to say 2 things very briefly in response. The first is that both of you touched on something that I think is very important, which is that our identities are multiple. We don't have one identity, right? We can be Indonesian and Javanese and very religious and higher class or lower class. We can be all of these things, right? And I think the challenge as empirical social scientists is that most of our data only allow us to look at one identity at a time, right? But hopefully in the future, we can construct other ways to measure more complex and multiple forms of identity, because all of these things can coexist in multicultural societies, and that coexistence itself is an important part of ensuring cohesion and inclusion and stability. And then the second thing I wanted to just mention is that I think it's very interesting to think about how globalization and increasing kind of digital connections globally, how that is changing identity. In the 1970s and 80s and even early 90s, in much of the Muslim world, and it was most pronounced really in the Middle East, but elsewhere in the Muslim world, as they were confronted with kind of the secular forces of globalization and kind of neoliberal capitalist expansion of markets and trade, there was a bit of a backlash. And that backlash took the form of what social scientists have called the Islamic revival and revivalist kind of movements across the Muslim world. And so there is a precedent for this big kind of shocks to identity and mobilization along a particular identity. And I think it's very interesting to think about how all of that is playing out today, not in terms of religion, solely in terms of religion, but also in terms of national identity and nationalism, as you both alluded to. So I have much more to say and look forward to chatting more. But let me address some of the excellent questions from the Q&A, beginning with the pop-up in the front. You asked two wonderful questions. The first was how much of the kind of perspective that I'm bringing and putting forward here is really kind of shaped by kind of free market development, capitalist view of the economy, and which of course is the core of our training in economics programs in the United States and elsewhere. And I think it certainly plays an important role, but I think what's also important to think about is that a lot of the kind of micro foundations of the neoclassical models of development and growth, they don't really think about these social issues, these connections between individuals, the role of kind of social groups in determining individual behaviors. And so I think in that sense, a lot of what I'm putting forward here is trying to speak to those audiences who think about neoclassical views of the world, the economic world, but try and broaden their thinking to incorporate the role of social groups in organizing themselves politically and economically. And then I love your description of Professor Mubyarto's his kind of academic life, and the fact that he had many more friends outside of and colleagues and collaborators outside of economics. And that's not surprising to me. I think for a lot of economists, let's say 20, 30 years ago, who were thinking about these types of issues, they were very much outside of the mainstream in economics. They did have that kind of experience that Pak Mubyarto had, which was, was very much, they were out on their own in economics and had to find friends in other social sciences. Now, what's happening in the last 5 to 10 years in the field of political economy in particular, which is the kind of the disciplinary home of the type of work that I do, you go to these meetings and you have people from political science, you have people from sociology, you have economists who work on culture that collaborate with evolutionary anthropologists, right? And so I think things are changing. And they're changing. It's happening much later than one would have hoped, but that I think it is changing, and in important ways that are going to broaden the scope of economics as a field, and allow us to answer in more compelling and generalizable ways a lot of these questions that previously economists have not really focused on. So I'm optimistic, and I think. I think Professor Mubyarto would look at the state of economics today and think, things are much better than when he was writing about these issues. And then the second question was about immigration, right? And how that's changing identity, and kind of, we know, in a lot of Western democracies, it's giving rise to lots of pressure, populist pressure. The rise of populism in other contexts has taken a very different form, in part because a lot of countries, Indonesia included, they're not major immigrant destinations, right? Immigration is not the kind of core issue that's driving a lot of the cultural divisions in society. But I do think if you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, these are places where a lot of the challenges are coming from immigration. But once you kind of put that aside and you think about the people once they are within the country, it's a lot of the same challenges that we were talking about today, and thinking about diversity and managing diversity, thinking about integration and assimilation. All of these issues are very similar, whether the populations are coming from another country or coming from different parts within your own country, right? And so I think a lot of these the challenges at their core, when you kind of strip out the border, are in many ways very similar. So I think you can think about these in a lot of the same ways that we've been talking about here. And then there was a question about the parallels with other post-colonial states. I think there are a lot of parallels. I think Indonesia is unique in some ways, and made very critical decisions that look very different from the decisions made by other countries, thinking about the choice of Bahasa Indonesia instead of the largest group's language. Thinking about the role of the military, I think is a great one that Jahen mentioned earlier. This is something that I think is very important and that we don't know a great deal about in terms of its implications for politics and the economy here. But there are lots of interesting parallels with other countries' experiences, and I think I'm personally trying to understand how, I do a lot of work here in Indonesia, but I'm based in the US. I come from a family of immigrants. These issues around diversity and integration and so on, they're very much about the American experience too. And I think understanding what the parallels are between America's, how they have managed diversity in the nation building process. It looks very different because America was countries based on settlers, whereas Indonesia is one largely indigenous population, but a lot of the same challenges in managing diversity and in the face of the kind of forces of social and economic change.
All right, thank you very much, Sam. Let's continue with our Q&A session. Okay, I'm going to take 3 again. I will do the online later. All right.
Selamat siang semuanya. Mungkin pertanyaan ini sound silly ya, cuma saya pengen tanya sama Mas Jahen. Yeah, I'm a civil servant too, Mas, and I do what you call pendidikat prajab and whatever itu. Saya ingin tanya sesuatu yang lebih bridging aja, Mas. Sebenarnya tuh nasionalisme itu, saya tuh bisa determine saya punya nasionalisme tuh kayak gimana sih, Mas, gitu. Itu tuh sesuatu yang terlalu banyak dibahas. Saya tuh malas banget ngikutin politik sebenarnya. Cuma untuk apa ya, representasi saya ini punya nasionalisme itu apa? Apakah hanya selesai pada gue punya sense of belonging nih gitu? Atau apa sih? Would you please tell me, aku tuh harus punya apa supaya nasionalismeku itu bisa driven aku untuk bisa punya kontribusi lebih. Orangnya ini adik-adik yang ada di sini, saya tuh kan udah dinas luar ke banyak daerah dan saya kerja dengan banyak orang dari latar belakang kampus yang berbeda. Mereka nggak dapat, Mas, kayak gini. Nasionalisme itu apa? Even integrity itu apa? Mereka nggak dapat, gitu. Apa yang harus saya miliki supaya saya punya nasionalisme? Dan apakah kebetulan kan kalau kita ngomongin 2045 kan adik-adik ini ya nanti yang akan semoga jadi main factor ya. Udah nggak ada lagi nepotisme, ensun gitu. Mereka tuh harus punya apa supaya mereka punya nasionalisme yang mereka punya itu bisa menjadi energi yang bisa membawa ke pertumbuhan ekonomi. Yang kedua yang saya ingin tanyakan, bisa nggak sih, Mas, poor people itu punya nasionalisme gitu? Saya ngelihatnya gini, saya bisa idealis mungkin karena saya sudah nggak punya kebutuhan mendesak soal finansial. Tapi bahkan PNS-PNS di daerah itu SPPD jadi jadi sumber penghasilan bagi mereka karena tunjangan mereka juga nggak oke kayak gitu. Apakah kita bisa meminta nasionalisme ketika mereka masih ada di survival, kalau saya bilang sih survival path kayak gitu. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there is
Hello, Professor Sam. I am Raka. I am from the Department of Economics at UGM. I want to ask a question. We all know that social media or digital platforms are widely and frequently used around the world nowadays by various generations. And what I want to know is, can media and communication strategies be an effective tool in national building for improving social cohesion? If so, how? Thank you.
is there okay.
Okay, my name is Adiatma, and I would love to ask to Mr. Sam. Mr. Sam, how you mentioned that there is an importance to integrate between people in country, and how long would it take to integrate people from in a country like immigrants to a new country, and also how many generations? How long will it take to build a sense of nation in a country? I mean, clearly in the case of, for example, Afghanistan, clearly 20 years are not enough to create a country. Thank you.
All right, so those are the questions. Please for the speaker to answer.
Jahen, you want to go first? Yeah.
I'm not the expert about nation building, so what I'm gonna try to explain, at least from my own personal opinion about how to boost national identity, especially for people who are not being exposed with what we've heard so far. I guess people will follow the leader, right? If you have the leader that show you what kind of nation building, if the leader shows you if you are an honest people, hard work, and so on and so forth, that will be the entry point to do this. And that's why we should have been able to allow, again, this is probably like political economy topic, that we have to increase good leaders to enter politics, so they have some role model for these people. That's, I think, the way that we really need now, because I think we've missing this kind of people in the country. So having some role models that can show you that if you want to be a good person, then it will automatically make you a very good Indonesian people, right? That will be one of my personal opinion. Because again, I haven't done any study on nation building. The second one, is there any impact of nation building on the economy? I don't have the clear answer on that. But what we've seen so far is many other countries that are very attached with their government, and especially these are the countries in East Asia. What we see here is if they are obeying the government, it's really easy to do any kind of policy. For instance, let me explain some example. When we had this COVID-19 experience, all of countries are really difficult to be managed, except people in Eastern Asia, because they have this Confucius identity, right, religious belief, where they're gonna follow the leader, right? But the leader who are also showing good actions. Again, we have a very diverse type of that, but maybe that will be very interesting to see in the future whether, again, some nation building will affect. But we've seen in previous study, especially from Parian and other people, like polarization will also affect some economic growth, right? So if you have a very distinct polarizations, it gonna affect the economic in the future. So I think that will be interesting to study further, but maybe we can do. We have to do many things in order to make sure that not only us here, privileged people, can know about the importance of being a good people, but also in many regions outside of Java, for instance. Right? Maybe Sam, if you want to add something.
Yeah. No. I think your response was great, and you're right. I think IPDN and other institutions like it play an incredibly important role in training the next generation. And these schools really are exposing Indonesians from all over the country to people that they otherwise would have only seen on television, right? And I think that's maybe over social media. I think so. I think it is very it's important, and it can create this strong civic identity and civic capital, and foster this notion that we're all part of a nation and not just our own home communities. So I agree that local leaders are super important, and it's an important area for future research. So on the question of social media and nation building, this is a great question, because if you look at the research on social media which is mostly done in the US and a couple of other countries in Europe, like some of the most compelling very recent work. And it shows that social media is very bad for polarization. It exacerbates polarization because it can create these echo chambers where you're only talking to people who think like you and believe the same things as you, because that's what the algorithms are doing. They're pushing you towards those echo chambers. And I think that's certainly possibly true and can have similar implications for thinking about cohesion and thinking about integration between different ethnic groups, different religious groups. So I certainly worry about those possibilities. But the other thing that social media can do is that it can create a space for innovators, people who are going to talk about things within religion, within other forms of identity that they might not be able to do on a big platform offline, because it might be harder for them to get these new messages, which may be more unifying across to a wide audience offline, where there may be other forces kind of preventing them from doing that. So I think the jury is still out on social media and identity and nation building. We kind of know that it's bad for politics in highly polarized places. But at least for the moment, I think Indonesia in particular just went through an election that in many ways was depolarizing. And so it's possible that social media in that type of moment, this type of moment, could be a force for further depolarization. By showing, I can be friends with someone, we can connect on sports or on our love for this type of music, right? Instead of just being fed this narrative that, our political differences are so deeply entrenched that we can't connect, right? And then there was a question about how long does assimilation of immigrants take? How long does the process of nation building and integrating diverse groups take? That's a very big, important question that I don't unfortunately have a ready answer for. I will say that there is some interesting research in the US showing that at least historically, that cultural assimilation of immigrants can happen very quickly, right? And there's also, it can also happen at very kind of critical moments, when, for example, there are external wars that can induce people to want to unify around the national identity. It can bring immigrants and minority groups into the national kind of framework for thinking about identity and culture. And so, it's just going to depend. Every country is going to be different. And, depending on what kind of outcomes you're looking at, I think the speed of integration could happen very quickly at some times and very slow at others. And there's really not kind of a one-size-fits-all answer.
All right, thank you. For the next question, we have some question from the online audience. I will read some for you. The first question is from Kanetasha Sabila. The question is, in the context of Indonesia, how has the change in cultural or religious composition within or across region affected intercultural or interreligious economic relation? Does increasing polarization or fractionalization also impact trade or economic cooperation in the context of Indonesia?
Great. So I think certainly diversity within regions shapes local politics and conflict. Rian's work has shown that for all of Indonesia. And some of my own work has shown that in the context of the transmigration villages, but also in terms of the Kabupaten, where we saw a lot of Pemekaran and where we have the data from SNPK on conflict. So I think certainly, you know, the within region diversity is an important element of what's happening in different parts of the country. And then thinking about kind of between region diversity, and you know, that's going to certainly matter at higher levels of political administration. But the thing about decentralization is that it's really pushing politics to get very local, right? This has, of course, been happening primarily at the Kabupaten level for a long time. But now with Dana Desa and the village law and everything happening in recent years, you now see things pushing down even more local, down to the Desa level, right? And so that's going to create kind of other pressures for diversity within villages to start being perhaps even more important, but also thinking about between village diversity in shaping the scope for cooperation in terms of public goods, where the economies of scale are happening at much larger levels of administration, thinking about roads and maybe water and sanitation, et cetera. And then in thinking about trade and economic development, there is good evidence that polarization can work against economic development. Fractionalization, I think, is a little bit, the evidence is a little less clear. But I can tell you, for example, in the context of transmigration villages, at least, where where we looked at these two measures, you do see that more polarized villages have lower levels of economic development, less public goods, and the opposite was true for fractionalization. So I think they generally go in opposite directions for the same reasons that a lot of the nation building outcomes are also going in the opposite directions.
All right, and then there is an interesting question from Ilmiawan Awalin from Universitas Airlangga. The question is, in the census of 2020, there is no more question identifying ethnicity. The ethnicity question was in the census of 2000 and 2010. Sam, do you think it is necessary as a part of nation building in Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually didn't know that they took that question out. That's unfortunate. One thing that I was hoping they would add, and that maybe in 2030 we can all collectively convince BPS to add this question. I would love to have the ethnicity question, but also give the option for people to respond Indonesian. That, Indonesian is my identity, not my ethnic group. Or even better, thinking about multiple forms of identity, it would be wonderful if they allowed people to report 2 identities or even 3, right? Thinking about, children in intermarried households, how do you respond? Pak Rian, how did you respond to the question from the census enumerator when they asked you about your ethnicity? Which one did you pick? Javanese, yeah, you pick Java, yeah. So you're forced to choose, right? And I think that kind of obscures the complexity of identities in interesting ways. So it'd be nice to kind of think about how to measure this. And of course, we can do this in surveys and so on in the IFLS in the next round. But there's nothing like the census in terms of covering the entire Indonesian population.
Okay, maybe Pak Rian or Pak Jahen wants to add something.
Yeah, I did a quick Google search and I found that there is a question on ethnic group in census penduduk. So it's there. Although I agree with Sam, that it doesn't really represent like your identity, and I don't know how to tackle this issue. Whether asking like the ethnic identity of your parents, that might be something that we can do, but then again, it's not gonna really solve the problem. Mas Jahen?
Yeah, I think me and Pak Firman is the member of Forum Masyarakat Statistik, so we can, and Prof. Sony, I think also joining us today online, so we can push BPS next year, to release it. Yeah, they not release it, so maybe Pak Firman we can push FMS to do that. So because again, it's really interesting, and obviously providing new question on multiple identity will be very interesting to look at. Yeah, but I'm not promised, right? So we can push it with Pak Firman together, but I'm not gonna promise everything can be done from our side. Thank you.
Okay, and then there is one more question from Arianto Panturu from NU Indonesia Project. The question is, I'm trying to link your land reform paper and mass schooling paper. Number one, land reform led to rise of Islamic political power. Number two, mass schooling encouraged Islamic school, for example, madrasah. Do you think the rise of Islamic political power led to the strength of Islamic school in competing with SD in press? Why were there not many Catholic or Christian schools, for example?
Yeah, great question. So I think, and it's a very important one, and one we've thought a lot about, which is what the land reform did. You got to remember that there's different Islamic organizations with very different resources. So Muhammadiyah and NU have, for a long time, had very large kind of Waqf endowments and lots of resources at their disposal. And in the 1960s, some of the land that was transferred into Waqf endowments indeed benefited NU and Muhammadiyah, but the relative kind of resource windfall that those organizations experienced was somewhat lower in relative terms compared to the more independent and smaller kind of Islamic organizations, more conservative Islamic organizations and Islamic leaders at the local level that were more resource constrained, right? And those were the organizations and leaders that were largely using those resources to build pesantren, right? And so that's where we think a lot of the expansion was happening. And so it was those more conservative, smaller Islamic organizations in different parts of the country that really benefited a lot and that enabled them to build a resource base to then expand Islamic education further in the 1970s as they were confronted with efforts by the government to build more public primary schools. So I think the two studies are definitely related, and there is a through line, but it's different organizations that are most well equipped to kind of compete with mass schooling being imposed by the central government.
Okay, there is an interesting question related to the religious school. This question is from Aditya Abdillah from Universitas Indonesia. Does the rising enrollment in religious school suggest that the process of assimilation within the framework Bhinneka Tunggal Ika will face greater challenge? Will this trend lead to the development of two dominant and competing societal norms, one religious and the other secular?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And in fact, I don't think that's what happened. And then this goes back to our discussion about multiple forms of identity. So in some ways, what at least the evidence we have from the study of SD-INPRES, it's really suggesting that it led to greater religiosity, right? So more piety in terms of your day-to-day practice of the Muslim faith, right? But it didn't really lead to a big change in your demand for religious politics, in your demand for Sharia, and your support for Panchasila, right? We don't really see much of a change in that. It's really just leading to more religiosity and a deeper kind of attachment to your religious identity, but not necessarily a kind of strong desire to compete with the secular state. And again, this goes back to the difference between the types of schools that were created after the land reform and the resource shift into Waqf endowments. Those schools tended to be much more conservative, as opposed to the ones that were really kind of created in response to N.Int.Dev.Ec, which tended in practice, at least from what we see of the kind of students exposed to those schools, more moderate, right? To put it in the terms of the of the political scientists used to describe the kind of ideological spectrum of Islamic organizations and parties in Indonesia.
Pak Jahen and Marian wants to add something.
I don't know, but this is probably from the working paper that we are working on now. So I think from the study that we've done, we show that the net enrollment rate for a region where the Islamic mayor are winning tend to be higher. So again, maybe because now there are many options for these people to choose which kind of schools that they want to attend. And yeah, and I think related to what Sam's paper has done is education is the way where they want to boost or expand their ideology, right? So maybe this is the transmissions or mechanism where many people can choose whether they want to go to these Islamic schools or to the secular schools, but I don't think there are some issues with that now.
Yeah, just a quick remark from me. Just trying to address the big elephant in the room here. That when we're talking about Indonesian politics, votes, and so on, I suspect there is a distortion in terms of voters' preference and the actual result of the voting. Just to give you an example, I went to Samosir last month, I believe, and in the predominantly Christian village, the winner or the winning party is an Islamic party. So that's a bit that's weird, and that can be interpreted in many different ways. But I just wanted to say that when we're talking about like real result of let's say voting, then it doesn't really 100% representing like the voters' true actual preference.
All right, I'm going to close with this last question, and this goes for all of you three. This question is from Paul Amores from NU. The question is nation building just too hard? Is it better to just have homogeneous states instead of trying to achieve multiculturalism? Please.
Ooh, that's a dangerous question.
That's why it's last question.
But it's a very good one to end on. I will say, look, I don't think it's possible to create homogeneous states. Europe did that by and large through very, very bloody wars that led to millions and millions of people dying. And I think they did it through other ways too, more benign forms. But in general, I don't think it's possible. I don't think that should be our objective, to like redraw national boundaries in a way that creates homogeneous states. And in fact, what Pemekaran Daerah here did was it did that in some places, but it also showed that you can't do it everywhere. And even if you try to do it in some places, you may activate new forms of identity that are going to basically emerge now that you're in a more homogeneous place. So I think, we have the boundaries we have. There are secession movements all over the world trying to create new, more homogeneous states. And that's a big challenge. But I think, as researchers, our objective should be to support policies that work against the kind of forces of secession that might lead to eruption of violence and war and remaking boundaries and identities in that way, because I think the costs are just way too high relative to the more benign and nonviolent forms of nation building efforts that are very difficult, but nevertheless, it's that hard work that I think will pay off in the long run.
Yeah, difficult question indeed. I have the opportunity and have the pleasure of going around Indonesia in many different islands, different places, and I believe that multiculturalism, having a lot of different ethnic diversity, can be both, having a good things and different things. As I said, as Sam have discussed before. Depends on the way, depends on how you look at diversity. It can be good or it can be bad. But I believe that after experiencing, looking at seeing a lot of different places in Indonesia, I still have a belief in this national building process. I would like to say that we are lucky to have more than almost 1,000 different ethnic groups. Even though that number can be, actually it's a bit exaggerated, like 700 ethnic groups, because if you look at the differences between one ethnic group and the other ethnic group is actually not that difference, depending on, let's say in Kalimantan, they have like hundreds of ethnic groups, but they can be categorized as like only several of different ethnic groups. So again, I believe in the project of national building, and I think it's going to be upon all of us to make sure that this is it's going to be a successful endeavor.
Yeah, this is a very sensitive question. So I think we need to preserve this heterogeneity in our culture, religions, but we also need to have one common goal, right? So all of this diversity, religions, ethnics need to be utilized in order to maximum the ultimate objective, which is increasing the welfare of the society, right? So how we can ensure that by having these several people, ethnicities, and all of this stuff can help us to increase the welfare of the society. Because again, that's the ultimate goal of the country, right? To make your people become more better off, happier, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't want to have a homogeneous country, because again, we are very diverse, but again, we have to try to utilize, maximize the heterogeneity of our society in order to make Indonesia is a better place. As Sam mentioned, he loves the country, and we have to preserve this uniqueness of Indonesia for the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for Sam, Pak Rian, and Pak Jahen. Everyone, let's give our speakers a round of applause. Okay, so that concludes our discussion session. Thank you very much, Pak Rian, Pak Jahen, and also Sam. I will give back the time to the Master of Ceremony, but we all should just stay here. Thank you, please.